When her partner committed to learning about depression, it was a turning point for them. And it, in the end, made their relationship stronger because it became something they were doing together. If you try to apply the sex stuff without applying the navigating depression with your partner as a team part, we're just back at the resentment part. It's not the depression that kills our relationship. It's the resentment that happens when we don't know how to face it together.
I'm Cindy Darnell, and welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, cultural, political, and other lenses, and find some ways to explore some very diverse erotic quandaries. This week on The Erotic Philosopher, we're talking with JoEllen Notte. JoEllen is a writer, speaker, researcher, and mental health advocate whose work explores the impact of depression on sex and relationships. Since 2012, she's written about sex, mental health, and how none of us are broken on her award-winning site, The Redhead Bedhead, as well as for Glamour, the BBC, Bitch, Psych Central, and more. You can read her blog at redheadbedhead.com and follow her on Twitter at JoEllen Notte. JoEllen's book, The Monster Under the Bed, Sex, Depression, and the Conversations We Aren't Having, was published by Thorntree Press in March of 2020. I'm thrilled to bring you today's conversation with JoEllen Notte on sex, depression, and the conversations we aren't having. JoEllen Notte, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. I'm really glad to be able to have this wonderful discussion with you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Cindy. I'm so excited to talk to you about all of this.
And you and I have known each other for a couple of years now through our mutual friend Elle Chase, who's also been a guest on The Erotic Philosopher. And I know from your writing work and your social media presence that sex and depression has always been your big topics that you talk about. And then you were able to secure a publishing deal and finally got a book out, which is now available for everybody to read, called
The Monster Under the Bed, Sex, Depression, and the Conversations We Aren't Having.
The link to the book and to JoEllen's work are going to be in the show notes as well for people listening. You know, in the ways that you and I have interacted online and in person about this incredibly important topic, and something that you really pointed out to me, even though I had been working in, you know, the therapeutic space for many years and then also in the sexology space for many years, you really pointed out the fact that there is not a lot of discussion and or research in how these two worlds intersect. And so when you decided to start writing this book, which is so incredibly needed, how did you find the process of marrying these two seemingly disparate worlds together?
So the idea of pursuing them together really just came out of me writing about my own experience with antidepressants and sexual side effects. And the amount of people who came to me, always in private messages and emails, never in tweets that other people could see, it was all very hush hush. And they said, you know, depression has impacted my sex life and my doctor doesn't know what to do about it. My doctor doesn't want to hear about it. My husband doesn't believe that that's what's going on. All of these things. And it made me realize that a lot of us were having these experiences, but there was there wasn't a place that we were talking about them. And sex, I know in other countries it's not quite as bad as this, but in the US, sex is a no-go topic. And I ran into a weird amount of people who wanted help with sex and depression, but would say things like, I don't need my doctor sticking his nose in my sex life. And then it's well, okay, but how then? How do we help this?
Yeah. You know, there's tends to be an over-medicalization of sex. And then potentially, an over-medicalization of mental health. What's your position on the relationship between medicine, sex, and mental health? I know that you're not a therapist. This is your lived experience, and this is really important. What's your opinion of how these things intersect with medicine?
I think that there's a lot of oversimplification of things. So, if emotionally you're a certain way, that's a diagnosis. Versus I've always been an incredibly sensitive person. I cry at television commercials, that whole thing. And I think the tendency frequently is to label that needs to be fixed, as opposed to recognizing that people exist kind of in different ways. And then with sex, the place this came up the most was in my surveys, people who had experienced erectile dysfunction. Their immediate response they got from doctors was to give them pills.
Yeah.
And a lot of them said, like, those pills didn't change the sensation or whatever. They just made it physically possible for me to have an erection. And that doesn't address what's the emotional component. It doesn't address how it feels. For a lot of folks, it didn't make for pleasurable sex. It just made the act that we recognize as intercourse possible.
And again, I mean, that oversimplification of sex, that it has to involve, you know, something going into something else. And if the something is not going into the something else, then it's not real sex, apparently, according to, you know, certain thought faculties around these topics. So, JoEllen, I'd love for us to be able to dig into some of the surveys that you conducted with real people living with these conditions through the lens of someone who also lives with these experiences too. How did you go about conducting the surveys, and what kind of information did you gather?
So all the surveys and stuff literally happened at the beginning because I said, I am somebody who wants to explore this topic, but I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. Yeah. How do I come at this and give people something they can look at and say, I'm not alone. This is happening to other people. So my first survey actually ended up being a bit different than what the book was about long term, right? But it surveyed 1,100 people. We asked them questions about, like, had they experienced sexual side effects? Had they felt prepared for that experience? Had they talked to their doctor? What kind of response did they get? And that survey actually even went into, like, patterns you've noticed. You know, when you're depressed, you're less into this kind of sex, but, you know, maybe you're still into this kind of sex. And
that's really useful.
Yeah, there was some really interesting stuff in that. Like, I got a group at a conference annoyed at me once because I mentioned that my numbers showed people were using toys less when they were depressed.
Oh, that's interesting.
And half the room was like, well, I don't.
Right.
But that's why we ask people.
Right. Because, and I think that's often the thing, is that in traditional clinical research, they're always looking for patterns, right? Which, you know, that's useful to a point. But when we're dealing with individuals with feelings and lives and relationships, patterns are like, so what, you know? Yeah,
a doctor told me early on in this whole process, when I first started my site, and a couple months later, I got put on a new medication and I couldn't orgasm on it. But I had asked the doctor before if that was a problem, and he looked up in a book and he said, no, it's not a problem. And so when I went to him, I remember this, it was in Boston, it was this very older professorly kind of doctor, and I sat down with him and I was like, I can't have an orgasm, and that's unacceptable.
Right.
And his response actually really shaped a lot of this process. He said, thank you for telling me that. Like, as doctors, we get the answers that are in these books. And the answers that are in these books come from what patients tell their doctors and what doctors deem important enough to pass on. Like, so if people aren't already talking about it, we then don't know. And that set us an alarm bell in my head of, like, well, a lot of us don't feel comfortable talking about sex at our doctor's office, but maybe they'll talk about it to the sex writer who they know from Twitter. And they did.
And so, in addition to discovering that when people were experiencing periods of depression, that they recognized that their use of toys was decreasing, what were some of the other pieces of information that really stood out to you in relation to how people live with depression and manage their sexuality and what they do with that?
I learned so much in this process. It was really cool because at the beginning I went in kind of using the language a lot of us use, lowered libido, not interested in sex. And I learned a couple of things, which was one, that there's the thing that happens where people just lose all interest in sex, like they don't think about it, it's not really on their radar. But there's another thing that happens for people, especially coping with depression, where it's like, sex sounds nice, but I don't want to get up and then take off my pants and I could put them back on later, and it all just sounds like too much. And that's a separate thing, but it frequently gets lumped together as, disinterest in sex.
Right.
And then the thing where I realized I fell into a trap like so many people fall into, that didn't get kind of righted for me until we got to the interviews. I forgot the possibility that people might have more sex when they're depressed. And when I got to my interviews consistently, from when it was a sample size of 20 to when it was over 200, approximately 25% of the respondents had more sex when they were depressed.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the reasons varied. I mean, some of them were, I do it because I need to feel the self-worth I get from it. some of it was, I am taking this medication and it caused my sex drive to go through the roof. And then some of it was just like, sex is my comfort, sex is my happy place.
Yeah.
I reached for that when I wasn't feeling well.
And I think, that's what, again, one of the really crucial things that I know in the work that I do, counseling and coaching people around sex, is that being able to find one's own inspiration to have sex. Sometimes it's horniness and sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's some totally seemingly unrelated reason, but it's not actually unrelated. It's completely related, because what inspires us to have sex is going to be different through our lives. And then when we're living with depression, it's going to be different again. So it's interesting that you're noticing that there were some people whose longing for sex increased. And, collectively, we do hear that people's interest in sex drops down, especially where medications are concerned that treat depression or claim to treat depression. Were the people that you were interviewing, were they people in relationships, people having hookups? Were they talking about solo sex? Were they people in open and non-monogamous relationships?
All of the above.
Right.
So I had them answer questions kind of like, let me see. We had everything from, I haven't had sex or a relationship in 20 years to, I am a non-monogamous person with 5 partners.
Right.
And like kind of everything in between.
Yeah.
That's kind of what led me to go down the path that I feel like the book kind of embraces, which is, what are the differences in how we get through depression together with partners? And, how do they respond to our new relationship with depression? And what can we do to make it not such a terrible thing that makes us all resent each other?
Right. So let's have a talk about that then, some of those things that you discovered. So that was partners' responses to folks living with depression, our responses to sex and depression, and then some solutions and things that people found that worked.
So I always say the big lesson I got out of this book, the thing that changed the whole book in the middle and all of that, was that we as a society say, this is depression. Depression comes with these things. These things make you not want sex, and that ruins your relationship. So ergo, depression is a relationship destroyer. What I learned from my interviewees and the surveys is that it looks like what's actually happening is we don't know how to talk about any of this together. A lot of people are skittish around mental illness, skittish around sex. There's not the freedom to talk about it. And so we end up resenting each other.
You mean partners end up resenting each other?
Partners end up resenting each other, right? So my partner only sees that I am less interested in sex, and he thinks that's about him, and I'm insisting it's not about him, and why are you being so annoying about this? And then we suddenly don't like each other, and of course we don't want to have sex.
Right.
And so for me, it was that it's not the depression that kills our relationship. It's the resentment that happens when we don't know how to face it together.
Oh my God, that is so liberating. It's not the depression.
Not. I really don't think it is. I think what I've noticed over the last 8 months or so promoting this book is things that have become second nature to me, where I say, like, we'll talk to your partner about this, or what did your partner say when you told them that? A lot more and more I'm getting the response, like, talk to them, like, with words, like, you want me to say that to them? And I feel silly because I feel like over and over I'm just saying, well, talk to them, have the conversation. And it's these conversations that we deem scary, and so we don't have, and then we end up disliking each other.
Did you find with your interviews and your surveys that there were some people who had lived with depression for, a number of years, a long period of time, and who just point blank refused to discuss it with anybody other than medical professionals who may or may not have been helpful? And then those who, as soon as they realized that perhaps this was going to be a pathway through this, enthusiastically started talking about it with their partners? And did those people have different responses to how they approached it?
So I will admit, a thing that went on in my interviews that kind of took away the opportunity for some of that nuance is that I learned early on something I should have known from my own life. Depressed people are not amazing at showing up for appointments. So when I tried to do talking interviews, I had 100 people sign up for slots and then 20 of them showed up. So moving forward.
Oh, wow. That's a big...
Yeah, it was big. So moving forward, the rest of the interviews were done as almost like essay question surveys. So people could fill them out in their own time and then return them. It was a Google form.
Right.
So it just popped up in my inbox.
Right.
But what that meant is that, they were answering the specific questions at hand, but I didn't get to talk to them about, like, how much did you feel comfortable talking about this? What I did see, saw a couple of things that stood out in this realm. I saw people who said, there's one woman who stayed with me the whole thing because she said when her partner committed to learning about depression, it was a turning point for them. And it, in the end, made their relationship stronger because it became something they were doing together.
Interesting.
Also, I had a couple of partners of depressed people with depression, kind of storm the gates and do the surveys themselves. And that was where I heard more like, well, they refuse to talk about it. They won't talk about it. I don't know what to do. And a thing that if I were doing it again now, I know to look for and ask about, but I didn't know then.
Yeah, and that's so interesting that even as for you, as someone who lives with depression and has written about it and spoken about it very publicly for many, many years, that even still there are things that you're going to learn as you start having more conversations, which is what you're advocating for. And it's so crucial that people understand that. And, of course, the irony being how, the medical and mental health communities at large have just completely sort of missed that piece. That doesn't seem to appear in any of the clinical literature.
There's like nobody, and I've seen therapists like for years and years. And I've mentioned earlier too, before we started talking, that I've had a struggle with adequate health care living in the city I'm living in. And so I've been through like 5 doctors in the last 7 years. And nobody has ever said to me, like, are you talking to the people you love about this? And it's been kind of such a game changer. And a lot of the response I've been getting to the book is like, yes, this is good for people in relationships, whatever. But if you know a person with depression, even if they're not your partner, read this book so you can help them kind of navigate that. And actually, I had hit this turning point this week where I've realized I think my work is going a little bit away from the sex and more into the, like, let's talk about doing this together. Let's talk about taking care of each other, handling each other with a little more care in a world that doesn't handle us with care.
Yeah, and I think, JoEllen, that is such a crucial piece of the puzzle. I mean, we can't help but see the sort of the space between sex and relationships, and then sex relationships, and then depression. But then for you to also be coming full circle around to saying, well, okay, let's actually put the sex part aside momentarily and talk about the pieces that live in between these chunks and what they all share in common, like the thread that actually binds them is the connection piece and the sensitivity.
It was a fascinating moment in the editing process of my book, because at one point I got back an edited version and I looked at it, and what I consider to be the meat of what I teach was gone. And I wrote to the editor and she's like, well, that was a lot of stuff and, it wasn't about sex. And I said to her, here's the thing. If you try to apply the sex stuff without applying the navigating depression with your partner as a team part, we're just back at the resentment part. Like, I don't want to read that book. I don't want to put that book in the world. And so all of that went back in.
I've done a lot of research into libido and desire, and I ultimately found very, very similar things, that when it's, the feeling of me versus you. So if someone's living single, let's say, and they have a decrease in desire and libido, oftentimes it doesn't really show up as a problem because there's nothing to, there's no reason to rise up to the occasion, as it were. So people who are experiencing a lowered libido and they're single often will learn to navigate that by just sort of accepting it or just being like, well, that's just how things are for now. When it becomes problematic, it tends to show up more in intimate partnerships where, one or more people are insisting that the partner be the one feeling sexual, and then it becomes this, high libido, low libido kind of situation. And again, even though, the medical literature and the clinical literature is looking for, solutions to this, so-called lack of desire. What is consistently missed is the nuance that actually occurs between partners and occurs in the dance of communication around, well, what are we talking about here? What kind of sex are we talking about? What kind of connection are we talking about? And if you're not enjoying the sex that you're having, it's very hard to want more of it. It could also be a question of, let's actually change what we're doing, or putting the sex aside and getting back on board as a team again, which is what you're saying, when folks actually come together and feel like they have a shared project. It increases the willingness to change.
I also noticed when I started writing about this, to me, a weird amount of the talk about sex and depression that was already in the media kept involving this one phrase that gets under my skin so badly. Just do it. There was a lot of just do it, because you'll realize sex is good and you like it and you wanted to do it. But here's the thing. What if you force yourself, you grit your teeth, you just do it, and you realize you didn't want to?
Yeah.
And then you're somebody who's already coping with an illness that has hijacked your brain, who now feels like you've given up control of your body.
Right.
And that's not a good road for anybody.
Yeah.
So I talk a lot about making conscious decisions around sex. That thing where you stop and you think about it, and maybe you say, like, I'm not into the whole thing today, but like maybe we do some spanking, and then you try something
right.
And it gives those couples the chance to touch base and see how they're relating to it and how that's evolving. And it also takes away that pressure to have all the sex all the time because that's the right thing to do because sex is good.
Yeah. And I mean, that bugs me as well, that whole, sex is amazing, orgasms for all kind of thing, which, I mean, it's not that I think sex is not amazing, and it's not that I think orgasms are terrible. I don't. But when it's this oversimplified kind of thing that, all sex is amazing and everyone's having orgasms, and if you're not, then you're missing out, is just, it's really unhelpful to a lot of people, particularly, people who are living with depression and people who are not that interested in genital-based sex too, frankly. It's a very kind of narrow story. So, JoEllen, I want to hear more about the kinds of things so for people who have got their partners on board and now they're starting to have discussions that you've identified through your research is one of the pathways that really seems to work for people. What kinds of things should they be talking about?
We have the making conscious decisions piece, and the end of that piece is talking to your partner about the conscious decisions you've made. I also talk about something that I love. I call it having a sexual skeleton key.
Oh.
So to me, it's that thing that, if I'm not feeling it, if that thing happens, maybe I will feel it. And to me, it's a way you can check in, and you can say I might be into it. Let's if your thing is, I don't know, massage, you can say, let's start with massage. And then, if massage doesn't do it for you that day, okay, maybe that day is not a sex day. But if it does, great. It's that little entry point, that thing you can give yourself a little litmus test with. And that way, it's not closing. I think what happens a lot is people close the door on sex when it gets complicated.
Yeah.
They say, we're just not having sex. It gives you ways to relate to each other sexually and keep that connection and keep that bond, but also be honest when you have no interest in it. And it doesn't become a thing about rejecting your partner. It's more about everybody knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
And
so that's a really crucial piece, I think, for people who might be listening, who are the partners of people who are living with depression, because, again, a lot of the focus tends to be on the person with depression, which is important, but also the person who's the partner of that person needs to get on board. And I think it's really important what you're saying for those people when they're hearing, no, I don't feel like it, or no, I don't want it, that they don't take that personally. That said, if this goes on for, a long period of time, the person who wants sex is, and let's say they're in a monogamous relationship, is going to get frustrated because, they've got needs or wants or longings that aren't being met. If the partner is understanding and says, okay, I recognize it's not about me and I am supportive of you, And I still am sitting with my discomfort now of not being able to have my erotic needs met because we made a commitment to be monogamous, and I'm waiting for you to get back on board. What suggestions, advice, information, anecdotes do you have for those people who might be listening?
So it's actually one of my favorite things that I learned from, I worked with a psychotherapist named Stephen Biggs on putting together the research and stuff for this book. And Stephen likes to talk about having a second adolescence.
Mm.
And that is, when he says you expand your definitions of sex, you explore all the things that can make you feel good. You try different things, and it gets you out of that thing so many of us fall into, where we're like, well, we're adults and we've had intercourse now, so that's sex for the rest of our lives. And it lets you play and try different ways to satisfy yourself, satisfy your partner. Like, it becomes a fun thing rather than this like big, huge bummer of there's no sex. So I know I've been through the low points and stuff, and my partner over the years has like discovered so many new toys and like all these things that he never even thought of before, because he's like had this time to be like, well, what do I want to do about this?
Right.
And it's actually been fun to watch him have that process, because he's started reading books and he's discovered all these different like routes to pleasure that had never been a thing for him before.
Right.
And so now when we're in the same space, sex drive wise, it's great. And when we're not, he's not just miserable and sexually unsatisfied.
Yeah. And I think, it's sort of one of those things that, sometimes you sort of have to have the breakdown to have the breakthrough, that it's not, I guess, until you're really corralled into having to deal with this that you then start going, okay, well, what are my options really, really? And I think so many of us have gone, through a pretty rough year this year with COVID. So I think there's nobody on the planet who has not been affected by this in some way, some more than others. But, for those of us who are still here, we've all found ways to adapt, but that we wouldn't have otherwise. And I think in that we can apply that same principle to this situation for people who are partnered with people living with depression, that, your sex life is not necessarily going to look like it you would ideally like it to be, or maybe how it was in the beginning. But that doesn't mean that there's no sex at all. It's just the degree to which you're willing to explore and experiment and have things be different.
And I think I'm actually going to use my own kind of COVID transition as an analogy here, because I think if we open our minds to exploring sexually before we hit a point where we absolutely have to, it's less of an adjustment. And this does sound like a bummer, but I was in a raging depressive episode for a year at least before COVID hit. I was already not leaving my house. I was already having everything delivered, like all of that. So when COVID hit, I was like, okay, I know how to do this. I can handle this. And I, quarantined with no problem. And I think it can be the same way if we kind of take on the curiosity and the fun of like, what are different ways I can make myself feel good? So then we know them and we have them in our toolbox. And it's not like, let me find this new way to feel good because I'm miserable and not having sex. It's more like, okay, we're not having sex right now. Let's do this thing I like.
Yeah. Have you found, and certainly among your cohort of research participants, for the people who were experiencing the lower libido themselves, or the lack of interest in sex, were there things that they found that were able to increase their libidos for those who wanted to take that path? Of course, there are going to be those who were like, my libido's dropped off and I'm cool with that. But for those who were like, no, I'm actually going to see if I can experiment and find something. Were there any things that stood out to you that seemed to be commonalities that were effective?
So we talked a bit about what I think of as like sexual workarounds. And so things that like people who are like, I'm not having an orgasm anyway when I have sex, like, so I'm not like, why bother trying and whatever. And some of them are like, some of them are really concrete, like high-powered wands, like a Hitachi magic wand type thing, got mentioned a lot because for people who have lost their ability to orgasm, that can actually get them kind of up and over that hurdle, or
Yeah.
it can induce enough sensation to give them something pleasurable, even though it's different than what they experienced before. Some of the things were like as simple as lubricant, because a lot of people on medications lose their ability to lubricate, and kind of because we don't talk about this stuff enough, I heard from a lot of people who hadn't realized, like, they were like, well, I'm broken now and sex hurts.
Yeah.
But there are things they can do. Also, what came up was the exploration of a bit more things we might think of as like kinky, like electrostimulation or impact play, because they introduce a bit more sensation. They're or different sensations. They're sexy and they're fun, and they were things people felt like they could do that didn't feel like as big of a commitment, as big of a like, now I'm going to have all the sex. It was more of a like dip your toes in, and that seemed to work well for people, having that idea of something we can do that touches on the sexual, and then if that triggers something, great. And if it doesn't, we've still had sexy fun together. And I did have one person who talked about how she applied what sounds like a mixture of the just do it idea and my like make conscious decisions. She said they had a date every week, and that was like sex date. And she's like, the first couple weeks she hated it. It was like this source of misery and anxiety. But then it became talk about sex with each other, like date. So she said, I would feel like, we'd talk a little and then I could just do it because I was in the place.
Yeah.
But also we'd talk about it and I'd be like, nope, not happening today.
Yeah.
And we would know that it was like okay to not have it happen today.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things that, like, for me, a lot of it is keeping in touch with your sexuality and with your partner as a sexual person you engage with, even when it's difficult, when it's tricky.
Yeah.
And I think that also helps close, like kind of narrow the gap between somebody who's coping with depression and somebody who is, normal as yeah.
For want of a better word, yes, all the normal people.
But when, a lot of times when you have, and really any illness, but like a mental illness, specifically in this case, you feel like you're on one side and the people who can do things the normal way are on the other side.
Yes.
And when you can kind of close that gap, I think it's helpful all around.
So much of what you're describing, JoEllen, I really see how there's a correlation also with menopause. I have experienced feeling depressed, but I've never experienced clinical depression in the way that I know some people live with it. So I have no personal understanding of what it's like to live with clinical depression. Bouts of being depressed, I think, are probably quite different. But I've noticed sort of my own experiences of maturing and experiencing perimenopause, how my own body has sort of shifted and changed, and and my libido fluctuates, even though I'm a very out advocate for sex and pleasure and masturbation and doing all the things, as much as you like. It's interesting also to notice that with a shift in hormones, I can feel less sensitivity at certain times of not even the month anymore, but certain times of the year, it seems to be. And how I have to, those principles that you were describing of let's talk about it and see if my body comes online, if my body kind of gets charged up, deliberately looking and working at ways to find where those ignition points are, and if they're just not there that day or that week or that month, to be okay with that and trust that provided everyone is on board, that they will come back in some way, shape or form, fully or a little bit. And flexibility, I think, is so important, because that, the narratives that we're spoon-fed about how sex is supposed to be, and especially how good sex is supposed to be, effortless, horny, just oozing out of every orifice, is really not the lived experience for most people, and certainly not the lived experience for most people over 35, let's say.
Yeah, and sex, there's this idea that, like, if sex is, if you're having it with the right person, or if it's right or good or whatever, it will just come naturally, and it's just supposed to be easy.
Yeah.
No, like anything else in life, like my way oversimplified analogy for this is like you wouldn't even build a bookcase with your partner without talking to them.
Right.
So like, why are you going to try and mash your bodies together for pleasure without speaking about how to do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do think right now you mentioned like how periods of feeling depressed can be different than clinical depression. But I do think it's important to recognize for people that honestly, when you're down in it, like your path out might be very different, but when you're down in it, it can feel very much the same, and you can have a lot of the same experiences. And the way the world has gone this year, a lot of people are having their first or maybe a recurrence of depressive feelings and experiences. And I feel like I've seen way too much conversation about like, well, but that's not clinical depression. And it's like, come on into the water. Like, come on, jump on in. I'll help you with this depression stuff. Because, you know, we're all in, there's that thing people keep saying, we're all in different boats at the same storm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
and I feel like there's a bit of that going on right now in the world. And if I can tell you how to, navigate your boat a little easier, I will definitely do it,
And I mean, you've done such a remarkable job of that with the book, and I think it's such a useful resource for people who are living with depression, people who have periods of feeling depressed, people who are dating people or married to people who are living with depression, and also for clinicians, people who work with people who are having sex and or depressed. Because as you say, like there's just the therapeutic communities, they don't know stuff and they don't know what they don't know, and everybody's a bit kind of out to pasture with this going, well, what are we supposed to do? So I would really encourage everyone to get a copy of this book, and it's available internationally in print, or
it is. Your best bet, like worldwide, is a site called Book Depository.
Yes,
and they do free shipping worldwide.
They are really good.
Yeah, they've been great, but there are even, I know, shops in New Zealand and Australia and Germany, the Netherlands. There's countries that are now just kind of carrying it independently, which
so
is great.
Great.
Yeah.
And so tell us again the name of the book.
The Monster Under the Bed, Sex, Depression, and the Conversations We Aren't Having.
It's I encourage everybody to get a copy. I got an e-copy, so that's something that because I like to carry my books around in my handbag, so I can carry 100 books at once when I'm on the train, and I love that. JoEllen, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and talk about sex and depression and the conversations we've just had. And again, for everyone listening, links are in the show notes to follow JoEllen on social media and JoEllen's website, and to reach out to you with anything that they may have to offer that's a conversation that needs to be ongoing. Thanks, JoEllen.
Thank you, Cindy.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation today with JoEllen, and for those of you who are living with depression, or even people who are not living with depression but experiencing fluctuations in their capacity to enjoy sex and relationships, I really encourage you to get JoEllen's book and reach out to JoEllen. For those of you who are regular listeners of The Erotic Philosopher, you'll see that sex and relationships are so much more nuanced and complicated than we're led to believe. And that's really what inspired me to create this podcast for you, to allow you to understand that the complexity of sex and relationships is normal, as well as being able to access the pleasure that we long to have when we learn the skills to find it. If you're enjoying The Erotic Philosopher, please rate and review us to help other people find the podcast. That really makes a difference in our visibility and our accessibility. You can also follow The Erotic Philosopher on Instagram and Twitter at The Erotic Philos, that's Philos. If you would like tailored support in your sex and relationship situation, you can head on over to my website, that's cindydarnell.com, CyndiDarnell.com, where you'll see the range of services I offer for individuals, couples, and multi-partner relationships, as well as my online pleasure school, which offers a suite of ready-to-go online courses you can take at home starting from today. There you'll also see the tab to select the Erotic Philosopher podcast, where you can leave a quandary for future philosophers to ponder. Thanks for listening. It's so great having you on this journey with us.